Okay, so here's what we have. On the left side of this screen, we're gonna hear some facts. Some crazy facts about blue whales, for instance. And then on the right side, we're going to hear a narrative that incorporates those same facts. Let's do it. All right, here we go. Blue whales are the largest animals on Earth. They can grow 80 to 100 feet long and weigh 100 to 300 tons. They eat about 4 tons of krill each day, and scientists think their songs may help them find their way in the ocean. Okay, now that was very interesting, but did you retain any of that information? Can you recall anything that was said? How about the order in which these things happened? You don't need to remember everything, but if you're anything like me, you probably at least remember something. Maybe the size of the blue whale or perhaps how much they eat. That's because our brains are wired to retain narratives better than lists of isolated facts. But what makes stories so sticky? Why do they grab our attention and make us feel something? Well, to answer that question, I reached out to Dr. Jordan Grafman, who is an expert in this field. He's a professor of neuroscience at Georgetown University and author of the book, War and Peace is More Than Killing and Dying. And he agreed to look at both of these two scans together. So here's what we see. The image on the left is what happens when we're listening to isolated facts. And then on the right is what happens when we're listening to a narrative. So what do you notice? What stands out to you? Well, let's get a little bit more specific. See that bright pink area in the middle? That area is called the prefrontal cortex, and it lights up whenever we are planning or making decisions or thinking about abstract concepts. Also note that dark gray area just below the prefrontal cortex. That's the premotor cortex, and it gets activated when we're preparing to move. Now meanwhile, on the right side where we're listening to the story, we see the exact opposite happening. The prefrontal cortex is now dark and not active, and that premotor cortex is nice and bright. So what does this tell us? It tells us that when we hear a story, we're less likely to think and more likely to feel. And it seems like the opposite is true when we're simply presented with facts. This fits with what we know about how stories engage our brains. As humans, we tend to think in stories. Stories help us understand the world around us and navigate through it. In fact, many researchers argue that our ability to process narratives sets us apart from other species. But what does this mean for you as a communicator? Well, as Dr. Grafton says, stories engage the emotional parts of our brain and bypass the rational parts of our brain. So this has huge implications for how we communicate information. If we want people to care about our ideas, then we need to package them in a story. But this isn't some sort of magical trick. This is based on solid science. There's nothing manipulative about it. We just need to understand how our brains work and use that knowledge to our advantage. So if you want to be a more persuasive communicator, here are 3 actionable tips you can use to hack your own storytelling. Tip number 1 is to start with conflict. As we saw in the brain scan example, when we hear a story, our prefrontal cortex becomes inactive. This area of the brain is responsible for rational thought and decision making. Instead, our amygdala lights up, which is the part of the brain responsible for processing emotions. So if we want to capture someone's attention, we need to appeal to their emotions. One of the best ways to do this is to start with conflict. Conflict creates tension and suspense, which activates our amygdala and makes us care about what happens next. Think about the story you heard earlier about the blue whale. What made it so memorable? Was it the fact that blue whales are the largest animals on Earth? Sure. But what really captured your attention was the conflict between the blue whale and the krill. The blue whale wants to eat the krill and the krill wants to avoid being eaten. This conflict created tension and suspense, which made you care about what happened next. So if you want to capture your audience's attention, start with conflict. Give your story a clear antagonist and make sure there is plenty of obstacles standing between your protagonist and their goal. Tip number 2. Show, don't tell. We've all heard the phrase show, not tell, but why should we do it? Well, it turns out that our brains are wired to process information differently depending on whether it is presented to us in a narrative or non-narrative format. When we're simply told information, our prefrontal cortex becomes active. This area of the brain is responsible for rational thought and decision-making. Meanwhile, when we're shown the same information in a narrative format, our amygdala becomes active. This area of the brain is responsible for processing emotions. So if we want our audience to feel something, we need to show them, not tell them. Showing creates experiences that activate our amygdala and make us feel something. Telling simply presents information to our prefrontal cortex, which makes us think about it. For instance, let's say you're trying to convince your boss to give you a raise. Which of these approaches is more likely to be effective? Telling your boss that I deserve a raise because I have been working hard and I am a top performer. Or showing your boss the results of your work, the positive feedback you've received from clients, and the impact you've had on the company's bottom line. The first approach is telling, while the second approach is showing. Telling simply presents information to your boss's prefrontal cortex, which will likely tune it out. Showing, however, creates an experience for your boss that activates her amygdala, which she'll be more likely to buy into. So if you want to persuade your audience, show, don't tell. Create experiences for them instead of simply presenting information. Make them feel something rather than making them think about it. And tip number 3 is to keep it simple. Our brains are constantly bombarded with information. In fact, we receive about 400 to 500 marketing messages every day. It's no wonder that our prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational thought, has become so efficient at tuning out irrelevant information. To overcome this, we need to keep our stories simple. Our brain loves patterns, and we are better able to understand and remember information that fits into an existing pattern. So if we want to capture our audience's attention, we need to make sure our stories are easy to follow and understand. This means using clear and concise language, avoiding jargon, and keeping our stories short and to the point. We also need to make sure our stories have a clear beginning, middle, and end. Our brains love stories that follow this pattern because it's easy to follow. This allows us to focus on the emotional aspects of the story rather than getting bogged down in the details. Think back to the story you heard earlier about the blue whale. What made it so memorable? Was it the fact that blue whales are the largest animals on Earth? Sure. But what really captured your attention was the simplicity of the story. It was easy to follow and understand, and it fit into a pattern that you're already familiar with. A story about an animal. So if you want to make your stories more memorable, keep them simple. Follow this formula and your audience will be more likely to buy in. So there you have it. 3 tips you can use to hack your own storytelling based on the science of how our brains work. These tips may seem simple, but they're based on solid scientific evidence. And when you use them correctly, they can be extremely powerful. Remember to start with conflict, show, not tell, and keep it simple. If you can do these 3 things, then you'll be well on your way to becoming a more persuasive communicator. Thank you for watching and see you next time.